So welcome. This is FUC, a weekly online speaker series facilitated by rent-burdened graduate students at UC Irvine in solidarity with the UC-wide cost of living adjustment movement. I am Thomas Williams, a PhD candidate in English at Irvine, and my ordinary co-facilitator, regular, not ordinary, of course. Molly Threlkill is a PhD candidate in visual studies. Our mission with this series has been both to widen the visibility of the COLA movement at the University of California, but also to create a space for conversations around labour and labour movements, as well as the future of higher education and the university. So for more information and to see recordings of our previous talks, you can visit our website at fuc-series.org or contact us at cola-or-perish@gmail.com. Molly and I also want to note that we view our role as facilitators as just that. So, and you should be able to see this from what's happening today. We're here to provide our energy and resources to grow the platform so that these conversations and vital discussions can take place. But above all, we're here to listen and learn alongside you all today. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our facilitators for today, fired UCSC Wildcats, Yulia and Tony. So over to you two.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Molly. Thank you for hosting this event. My name is Yulia.
And I'm Tony. Hi.
We're two graduate student workers at University of California, Santa Cruz, who were fired for our participation in a Wildcat strike for a cost of living adjustment that began in December last year, starting with a grading strike and shifting to a full teaching strike in February that spread to campuses across the UC system. We're also two international students whose visa statuses have been threatened by these actions of the university. So we're happy to talk more about the history behind this. For now, we will drop some links in the chat for further reading and listening and watching. There is a link to our general website, the Strike Fund, that you're welcome to donate to if you're able, an article that goes sort of in depth of our thinking behind organizing for COLA, a podcast, and a video. So multimedia resources. And then Tom should drop them in the chat.
So where this event is coming from, after more than 80 of us were fired from our spring teaching appointment at UCSC, that many others were disciplined through student conduct processes, and many more were beaten and arrested by police in riot gear at our picket line, drawn from all over the state. After that, we received an outpouring of solidarity from across the world in many forms of material, financial, and symbolic support. One of these forms has been the UC Boycott, arranged by a group of scholars, mostly outside of the UC system. And it calls for prospective guest speakers to refuse to provide lectures or speeches either remotely or in person at the University of California until the fired graduate students are reinstated and there's no further retaliation for strike-related activity. So all of today's panelists, Lauren Ballant, Timothy Brennan, David Palumbo-Liu, Dylan Rodriguez, Mackenzie Walk, and Lali Halili, who has a pre-recorded message for us. They're all signatories of the UC Boycott.
So the case for the boycott was made as having 5 strategic elements to it. Firstly, it has been presented as a natural extension of a strike in that it allows academics outside the UC to withhold their labor from the university. Secondly, it hurts the UC brand and presents a PR disaster to the institution. Thirdly, it has been designed to build struggles outside of the UC and connect national and international struggles in higher education. And one of the COLA slogans has always been spread the strike. So, and we're hoping to talk more with scholars from other institutions today. Fourth, the boycott is designed to communicate that in times of academic restructuring in COVID, the summary dismissal of academic laborers does not go unnoticed. And lastly, it is designed, of course, not to stifle any discussion, but to encourage discussion and encourage debate of the critical issues of our time, both within and outside of the university. Much as the series has enabled, which is facilitated by grad student workers at UC Irvine, but held off UC platforms. And you can read more about the boycott on our website, and Tom is going to drop the link in the chat.
So we've invited our guests today, both in their capacities as intellectuals who we admire and want to think through theoretical and practical questions with, and also in their capacities as tenured faculty who have stood in solidarity with us in the way that we asked of them by withholding their labor from our institution. We want to use this occasion in part to connect struggles happening in and beyond higher education. We also want to make space for conversations outside of and against university platforms. And we also want to use this occasion in part to investigate the possibilities and limits for faculty shows of solidarity. While at UCSC, on the one hand, we saw some of the most coordinated and powerful organizing among faculty that we've seen in years, with the rise of the Faculty of a Cola group, lots of other organizing that went on. On the other hand, lack of solidarity from a majority of faculty has, throughout our struggle, presented us with significant hurdles to winning our demands. Indeed, if tenured faculty had themselves gone on strike, our struggle would have been won much sooner.
One thing we're going to say is our union is currently in mediation with the university about reinstatement of fired graduate student workers. Unfortunately, we're hindered in talking about this because we're yet to sign a joint communication agreement with the university about these news. What we can say is that it looks possible that we will have made some significant gains for the fired graduate students. We can also say that many students, both graduate and undergraduate comrades, continue to be disciplined through the student conduct process. In particular, we're fighting for Carlos Cruz, who we'll drop more information about in the chat, who is appealing against the 2-year disciplinary suspension, which is the most egregious effect of student conduct discipline. And this process had disproportionately harsh effects on militant students of color, and has heavily relied upon police testimony as evidence to build cases against student activists. So as such, while we feel hopeful for the fired graduate students, the terms which would end the boycott have still not been met. After months of organizing, mass condemnation of the university repression of student activism, and other organizing tactics.
So the format of the session is going to look something like this. We're going to open up with some questions for the panelists, which will loosely direct to certain panelists, but of course others should hop in. They can pass if they want to. That's okay. After that, we're going to open it up to a comment session, Q&A. For the remainder, so if people want to ask a question, they should message Julia to get on Stack. Or if you don't want to ask the question, you can send your questions or comments to Julia, who can read them out. But first things first, we're going to play a recording from Laleh Halili, who's at the Queen Mary University of London, who can't join us today, but who's going to talk about particularly about struggles in the UK, which, if we want, we can discuss a little more in the Q&A. So we're going to play that now, if Tom is able to.
Hello, I'm Laleh Halili, and I'm a professor of international politics at Queen Mary University of London. I'm honored to have been asked in support of the COLA activists and strikers. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between the UK and the US and some of the elements that have most recently rocked the UK higher education sector and what those might mean for your protests. Of course, the UK, like the US, has a very tiered system in the sense that there are some universities that are better resourced and are distinct and distinguished by their extent of their class and racialized difference, by their use of precarious workers, by the salaries they pay, etc. But the other element element that I think is very similar, and which I think that to a great extent influences the way that the universities in the US and the UK operate, and perhaps more so than other universities, say for example in Europe, is the financialization and neoliberalization of the universities. In the US, of course, this translates into the endowments becoming essentially investment portfolios to which the university essentially becomes an educational arm. In the UK, this financialization is around the role of universities as essentially holders of real estate, in particular in very dense and expensive cities, in London, for example. But in addition, debts that have been acquired in the UK by the universities in order to pay for various kinds of capital projects or covering their previous debt have covenants attached. We have discovered that essentially allow for financial institutions to push austerity measures on the management of the universities. In addition, the transformation of the universities, where the managers are now professional managers, often even if they were previously university faculty themselves, that means that the models that they use in order to sort of manage the universities tend to be very managerial models. And so austerity, divide and rule, precarious employment conditions, and flashy, spectacular projects that often come to naught tend to be part of that. In addition to that, in the UK, there are some differences. We have a much stronger audit culture and a great deal more red tape. But the second and bigger difference between the UK and the US is that we do have a trade union that has traditionally been quite strong and has been representing not only permanent faculty. We don't have tenure in the UK. We have, or in most of the universities in the UK, we have something called permanent contracts versus fixed-term contracts. And our union, USU, UCU University and Colleges Union, has represented us in a series of sort of collective bargaining processes. And in fact, in the last 2 years, we have had a number of quite long strikes for various causes. Now, some of the factors that have emerged in these strikes, I think, are quite important to note, and it might be of use in your struggles. Number one, obviously, the role that the government or the state plays in sort of the conflicts between the labor conflicts between the employers and the employees, in this instance the universities and the various faculty, it often actually ends up being quite detrimental to the employees. So, for example, you have the National Labor Relations Board in the US, which has in recent times come out against adjunct and graduate teacher strikes and rights and ability to unionize. And in the UK, under the Blair-Brown Labour regime, we had rules passed by the Parliament which severely restrict our ability to strike, to ballot and to strike, which means that it creates a system of divide and rule between different higher education institutions in the United Kingdom. So some go on strike, others don't, and of course what that means is that differences and divergences between those intensify. But in addition to that, another factor that is has been of quite significant is the difference between the kinds of causes and issues over which we have struck, and where, for example, pensions for permanent employees was a factor. We have seen broader and better supported strikes, whereas there's been a little bit more, less enthusiasm about, for example, the conditions of work, in particular for our precarious workers, our colleagues on fixed contracts. And so I think that element, to become aware of the internal politics of the unions, is quite important. One of the other things that has been, I think, quite significant is the extent to which the USU can connect its fights to those outside of the higher education sector. And I think that we haven't always been very good at that in the UK, whereas I think you in California have a particularly good occasion and ability to connect your fights around cost of living and around questions of expensive housing and availability of support to broader fights in the community. And what has been fascinating for me as I have watched you from afar is the extent to which such extraordinary actions could actually bring in a much broader base of support to your activity. That is really just, I wanted to mention a few things that I think that is quite significant. As I said, I think it's important to recognize divisions within the unions. I think it's important to recognize the extent to which your causes need to have your own mobilization around them, and the extent to which, if you can connect your activities to those in the community beyond the higher education sector, you might be able to make a lot more of your activism, of your strikes, and of your mobilization. I stand in solidarity with you, and I wish you all the best in the next phases of your struggle. In solidarity, goodbye.
Thank you, Lally. Thank you for sending this. We're gonna move forward and ask a few questions to our panelists. And we want to start with a question about revolutionary horizons within the university. And unless there is someone else who is dying to answer, we actually want to start with Jillian Rodriguez, our resident UC faculty member. And to sort of set the tone for the conversation, we want to ask, is radicality available within the university? And should we move towards abolition? And I have a sense of how Dylan might answer, but so the second question is how?
Well, first, let me start by expressing my appreciation for your organizing of this event and my admiration at the amount of attention that is drawn. I recognize a lot of friendly faces and names of people I admire in this participation list. So it's a real honor to be given the privilege of talking to this group of folks. I also want to say I want everybody who can afford to do it, who has any funds sitting around, to donate to the strike fund. I don't know if y'all know that the strike fund to support the fired UC Santa Cruz and other student strikers is almost evaporated. So I donated before, and I just logged on before this and donated again. So I'm hoping folks can match that gesture and log on and do that. I don't know if you all already posted that link in the chat, but I think the first important act of solidarity that some of the folks on this event can offer is to maybe donate $5, $10, $1,000 if they can afford it. So please do that. Regarding the university as a site of struggle, revolutionary or otherwise, there's a couple points I want to make to start the conversation, and I want to see where this goes. One thing is that the university is and always has been a site of war, in a literal as well as a metaphorical and figurative sense. It's all the above. The university engages in warfare in the totality in which we can understand that term. The university occupies indigenous territories. It displaces, polices, criminalizes, and kills Black people. Its condition of possibility is the chattel institution, as well as the racial colonial genocidal regime of the United States and of this hemisphere. And in the present tense, it is engaged in quite literal forms of psyops, direct physiological force, surveillance technologies, intimidation, economic evisceration, the kind of leveraging and weaponizing of people's basic needs, affective, health-based and otherwise. The university is a site of war. And to the extent that we understand that fact, that the university engages in a totality of warfare against vulnerable populations and those which it deems as within the continuum of disposability to hyperexploitability. To the extent we can understand that, I think what we need to do is to start taking that analysis more seriously, which is to say that the struggle on university campuses is, in a real sense, guerrilla war. It's guerrilla war. It's not to limit it, of course, to armed struggle. It's to say that in a guerrilla war, everybody plays a role. There's above ground, there's underground, there's folks who are inhabiting these violent war-waging institutions that have a profound opportunity to leverage the fact that they're employed in these institutions, maybe even tenured by them to whatever extent tenure holds up in the coming years, to continue to undermine the racial, colonial, and anti-Black logic of these institutions. This is the first point I want to make, is that we need to understand that we are engaged in actual warfare in the United States of America for sure, but the universities and college campuses are not outside of that structure, right? They're actually central to it. And the history of radical student movements and freedom movements that have both originated on campuses and which have become part of campuses demonstrate that clearly, right? Whether it's radical queer movements, Black liberation movements, indigenous aboriginal movements, so we can go all the way on down the line. Those radical liberationist, anti-colonial, abolitionist movements all understand and understood the university and the college campus as a central site of intervention, of kind of insurgent occupation, right? Of liberatory praxis, of knowledge production, of cultural production, of creativity, and everything else. There's a way that the institutionalization of some of those practices has abstracted the conditions from which they came, which is people actually waging in liberationist struggle, that is counter-war, against oppressive racial, colonial, chattel, anti-Black, eviscerating war. That's what we're in now. I would say that what went down in UC Santa Cruz is just symptomatic of it, right? It's profoundly symptomatic of it, but it is one symptom of it. One of the conversations, and this gets toward the question of abolition, one of the conversations I find myself having over and over again with many of my colleagues is the fact that, you know, the Black radical, Black abolitionist-led insurgencies, revolts of the summer 2020, the conditions that these revolts are exposing are in no way new, right? What happened to George Floyd is symptomatic. What happened to Breonna Taylor, symptomatic. What happened to Ahmaud Arbery, symptomatic. And the fact of the matter is that is also the case on every single campus on which we work. That to the extent we have police presence on these campuses, you have, at the bare minimum, a bifurcation of experience on these campuses, where some folks live in a climate of fear and terror when they encounter university police. Others probably experience the police as protective forces. There's not a lot of room in between that, right? And that's what war feels like. That's what war feels like. So the question is what side we want to fall on. The last point I want to make, and this is addressing directly the conditions of our folks that have been fired, that are being punished, that are being criminalized, and so forth, as a result of COLA, the struggle for COLA, the struggle really for sustainable life is really what this is. There's a way in which the current struggles around policing and university policing in particular unintentionally let administrations, university administrations off the hook by failing to understand how university administrations and university police are in the same continuum of policing. They are not separate from each other. In other words, administrators are cops of a different type, right? You can look at university bureaucracies and see this in a literal sense. At my university, the police report to one of the vice chancellors, right? So even though you have a chief of police, the chief of police reports to a university administrator whose office is in, you know, that building that houses that houses the chancellor. So there's no separation between those two kind of sub-apparatuses of the university. Administration is the police are the administration. It is a continuum of policing at the university. So if we're going to take seriously some of the best of what folks are doing right now around pushing the limitations of the defunding the police model and toward an abolition of the police, an abolition of policing model, what we are also talking about is an analysis that has to expand so that we understand that what my former colleague at UC Riverside, now the chancellor at UC Santa Cruz, Cindy LaRive shamefully has done at Santa Cruz is a policing action. And it is her policing action. It's not just that she has deployed police on you. She has taken up the the kind of institutionality and the power and the logic of policing as part of the chancellor's office. And the thing is, that's what she is actually supposed to do. It's not exceptional. So I think we need to understand that continuity. Administration and police are part of the same continuum of police protocols, police power, police violence. So if we're serious about thinking through this particular moment of radical to revolutionary to abolitionist struggle, I think what we need is an analysis that understands what we are up against and understands the university as being situated as a central infrastructure within the waging of this kind of oppressive war. And I talked too much, so I'm gonna shut up for a second.
That was really great. Thank you, Dylan. I kind of want to continue thinking through that. We've come up like at this question of whether or not COLA is a reformist fight or an abolitionist fight, and how we can think about students and workers struggle for fair wages within an institution they strive to abolish. So I wanted to ask David, as a person who teaches courses on scholarship and activism, if you could, if you could help us think through that question.
You have to unmute.
What was the question again? I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the last part of your question.
So the question is basically how students and workers can struggle for fair wages within an institution they strive to abolish without strengthening the institution.
Right. Well, to begin with, I wanted to pick up on something that Dylan said about war, because there's a very useful essay. Well, actually, it's just a talk that James Baldwin gives in 1964, and it's simply called Talk to Teachers. And he says, he coins the phrase, the paradox of education. And he says, the moment that you graduate, you become at war with your society. In other words, if the school does the job it's supposed to do, which it doesn't always, he's talking to elementary school teachers, that you become a mature person and understand how bad the society is, and it's your job to go to war. So I wanted to second what Dylan said. We at Stanford have a number of struggles that have attached students with workers. There's a group called Students for Workers' Rights, and we won continuance pay for subcontracted labors. And I would say that what you all are doing is providing an enormous kind of education to the world. In other words, you are making evidence the exploitative nature of the university. You are teaching your students that the things that the university wants to invisibilize, in other words, all these operations of power and inequity, for the sake of this, as Lale said, a kind of market-driven logic, which is utterly dehumanizing, takes place within the university, latched onto these larger structures. So what we've done in working with students here about issues of police in terms of workers' rights is to always show that the university is not isolated for anything. It is embedded in these structures that we see. And as Dylan said, it's the job of administrators to keep the machine going. And so we always suffer if we isolate the university because we miss that analysis. One other thing I want to say about abolishing the university, we have to understand too that there's a reason why the right wing is going after universities, because they understand that with concerted effort and alliances and solidarity, it's the only space that there is, a shrinking space nonetheless, where any notion of the public comes out, and any notion of dissent can really emerge from in exactly the environment that produces the ruling class, right? So I think this is a very important site, not to give up, but rather to strategically mobilize within.
Okay, thank you both. So we're going to shift a little bit. This is a question, unless they want to pass it on for Lauren.
I just wanted to respond to the last. I mean, Dylan, that was amazing. But I want to respond to kind of 2 points in the last discussions that, or maybe three, that I think are worth just putting on the table. One is, we didn't really get, in David's response, we didn't get to the question of workers trying to reproduce life in relation to the struggle for abolition. So it seems like we haven't really defined abolition today, and there's a lot of, people mean a lot of different things by it. My understanding is that what you're trying to abolish is the world in which the university would reproduce itself the way it has. It doesn't mean that there would be the end of learning. It doesn't mean there would be the end of collaborative thought. It doesn't mean there would be the end of brainstorming. It doesn't mean that there would be the end of research, even, or study. So I think, in a way, the question is formulated as though to abolish it means to abolish the means of the reproduction of life. The question is, what is it for, maybe more than should it exist as such. I mean, it shouldn't exist as such. Should it exist in some form or something like that? I wanted to say that. Second thing is just to modify, to add to what Dylan said. It seems like an important register of thinking about alliance politics right now is the discourse of care as a kind of response to an interference with the reproduction of power. And I think, one of the things that Dylan could have said, because he said everything, but follows from it is that the university makes its claims about control in the register of care. And so trying to understand how it uses and masks and in magic, there's a thing called, misdirection, where, the hand goes over here, but the rock is still there or whatever. So they use the discourse of care to misdirect our attention. And so many student claims are translated into the discourse of care, which the university claims that is therefore on your side. I don't know. I think it would be interesting for us to talk about that part too. Like, why didn't we know it's war? It's partly because of this whole loco parentis problematic, and also the idea that resources are a form of care and stuff like that. And then the third thing I wanted to say, and this is maybe a little disagreement with David, is I don't think the university is the only public left for the production of worlds. And I think one of the things those of us who are politically engaged in not reproducing what has brought us here and inducing some other worlds, I mean, I'm kind of a heterotopian. Like, you have to invent these different spaces of collaboration and stuff like that to be able to make worlds from where we live now. And so one of the big questions at our moment, in the post-Thatcher world in which there are no publics, there are only individuals or whatever, is, what does it mean to think the thought about public is the same thing as thinking the thought about community? Is it the same thing as thinking of the thought about alliance? And also class formation or class status or something like that. And so I just wanted again to raise these questions as whatever a music room would be if it was an idea. So that's all.
So Tony, if the idea is to move on with a different line of questioning with Lauren, could I just say something about the last question before we move on?
Yeah, this is good. We can Timothy and Mackenzie, if you want to follow this line of questioning,
yeah. I mean, it's certainly true that people could theoretically pursue research and be involved in creative thinking and advertising the notion of a public were it not for a university. But I would say that we have to recognize what a precious institution the university is. We have to recognize that it is a cultural norm that many parents and students consider to be an automatic road to middle-class success. There are very strong historical and financial and institutional support networks for the university. It is one of the very few institutions that as an institution is particularly geared to critical thinking and to debate and to imagining alternative worlds. So to me, any talk of the abolition of the university as though it were a radical gesture would be one that I would virulently oppose. I would say that this would be a form of ultra-leftism that we should be cautioning against. There's a tendency, I think, when one is involved, close and personal as a student or faculty member, recognizing that the university reproduces many of the unequal social relationships that other institutions do, that it's operating after all, it's a a money-making enterprise that is promoting bourgeois values, that we want to strike out against it, because then it becomes part of the enemy. It isn't different from these other institutions in those respects, and that indeed is true. But I think this is making the mistake of trying to eliminate the proximate first, and not recognizing that, comparatively speaking, the university is a progressive place, a utopian space in some ways. Although, as Dylan, I think, eloquently pointed out, there are wings of the university which are operating at odds with those who are involved in critical thinking and questioning bourgeois values. So I think that the biggest thing, and this is what I'll end with, the biggest thing that seems to me, or not the biggest thing, it's one of the important things that are involved in any attempt to think through political radicalism among students and teachers at the university, which is presumably what we're talking about right now, is to try to avoid the immediate connection between a radical theory and revolutionary practice. It seems to me that these things are not the same, and that one of the greatest problems I see are graduate students entering programs in the humanities, for example, who think that what they're involved in is an immediate form of political revolutionary activity, insofar as they're writing essays about these things and thinking about them and quoting theorists that they take to be revolutionary. I think that this is a huge impediment to actual revolutionary struggle, and that we need to be against this notion in the same sense that I think Marcuse, as Angela Davis in her memoirs about working with Marcuse back in the 60s and 70s, made it very clear that even then the very same kind of problem was there. So I would have us look back at history and try to be cautioning ourselves against this immediate equation of praxis with theoretical radical declarations.
Mackenzie, would you like to respond?
Just to say, universities are very heterogeneous institutions that do a lot of different things. And if you're talking about the UC system, that includes some of the biggest, most prominent research institutions in the world, which are mostly about science and technology, where the teaching mission is a thing that, if you're a parent or student, is very, very central. But as far as administrators are concerned, is actually just one of a portfolio of things. California, I don't know so well as New York, but like NYU is also one of the biggest hospitals in the entire city. So one has to, when talking about the university, bear in mind that it has all of these components. And I think even just thinking about what all of the kinds of labor are in all of those components gets you some way to thinking about things like coalition building. I teach in a undergraduate liberal arts program. In fact, I resigned my position in the graduate school over a number of issues, so I'm very focused on undergraduate education, and that gives you like one perspective, but that's only one of multiple forms of what this is. But just thinking about that part, the extent to which in the United States particularly, but elsewhere, the fate of that role of the university is kind of reproducing labor, but then also of, the sort of opportunity hoarding in that Weberian sense of like only particular kinds of slots are going to be available to certain people depending on access to that credential. Those functions very much got tied to the model of debt, and a really quite unique form of debt in that you cannot declare bankruptcy to get out of it in the United States. That I think is very much at the center of how the university is perceived broadly. But yet it's only one of the things that it does, and to sort of think through that piece as connected also to then what happened on the research side as sort of different but related aspects of the university being sort of fully subsumed into a kind of political economy based on information and based on training people for forms of labor in that, but then also based on producing the techniques that at the same time de-skills and proletarianizes all of the jobs that people are being trained for. So there's a kind of internal tension in the mission that on the undergraduate side, we're sort of training people for jobs that increasingly become proletarianized. On the other side, that's designing those jobs into things that can be managed and surveilled and so on. And I think that internal contradiction is the thing that's finally come home to roost. And you know, with the sort of inevitable rising cost situation, mostly caused by the withdrawal of state funding, but it's just a fact that costs in sectors like higher education rise faster than inflation. And year on year, that 2 or 3% increase really starts to compound. And I think we're just at a crisis point, particularly with COVID, where that's really not sustainable anymore. So I think there's a kind of a struggle around just keeping any of us employed is what's going to happen in the foreseeable future. But this could be colored by the fact that yesterday, those of us at the New School got the memo that the administration is planning for a 25% and 50% cut in revenue for next year. And no faculty are involved in that negotiation at this moment. So you can just imagine exactly what those scenarios are going to be. So that does somewhat, you know, it's taken away my ability to think about this long term because I'm a little focused on this immediate short term issue. But I just want to highlight the multiple components of the university and their relation as a thing to focus on.
David, did you want to add?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I want to thank both Lauren and Timothy because Timothy expressed my perceptions much more eloquently and comprehensively than I did, and Lauren raised an essential point. And between the two of them, they basically are writing the book that I'm finishing up for Haymarket, which is called Speaking Out of Place. I want to give one example of what I was talking about, which is work for Palestine. And if you think of the importance of Students for Justice in Palestine and how they brought into the academy, along with working with folks in BDS and in Palestine, this taboo subject, they've made this taboo subject prominent before people that are going to go in, as I said before, to be quote unquote leaders. So I think that that's a really important example of how activism in the university can make use of that space, which as Lauren said quite rightly, is one of liberalism and care and diversity, and exploit that opening and show, well, if you're going to be diverse, why aren't the Palestinians here? So I think that that's basically the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thanks all. So I think the way that we'll format it is this. We'll have another round of our questions that anybody in the panel can answer, and then we'll move, because we really want to open it up to a Q&A comment section, and these really can just be comments because I know we have a lot of people here from a lot of different struggles and different institutions. So, okay, that said, the next question I want to direct to Lauren because they have to go in quite shortly. How do you think the university values academic labor and academic capital, and what power is there in publicly withholding that from the university or from the University of California?
I'm sorry, that broke up a little bit. Are you asking me how does the university value the labor that reproduces it and which is like it exploits it? So, but the second part was, what does your movement toward withholding or withdrawal do?
So this is we're kind of directing this at sort of faculty, how the university values academic labor and academic capital, what power there is in publicly withholding that from the institution.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so a few things. One, I'll just say very few things here. One is that a friend of mine talks about the university as a place of reputation washing. You know, this is where people donate money and, you know, align themselves in all sorts of ways with what looks like, I mean, I didn't say the university was like a good liberal subject. I was saying like it pretends to be a good liberal subject so that it can hide the ways in which it totally isn't. So, you know, I don't even know, you know, its conditions of value are fundamentally reputational. And when you start to do, as I have, you know, spent my whole career doing at my university, like be inconvenient to power, when you start to be inconvenient to the reproduction of power in not in individual ways. I mean, everybody can write a letter to the provost. I don't really care about that. But like where you organize people to and change what the public sees as the public face of the university. That's it, the publicness of strikes, the publicness of protests, the publicness of organization of knowledge, of counter knowledge is incredibly important because it would like the default to be smooth, this default of its value, its structure of value to be smooth. So I think all of that really matters. I mean, but the thing about, you know, I've been protesting with you privately about the whole question of like whether I'm boycotting now by showing up for this, since I'm doing exactly what I would do if I wasn't boycotting, which is you would invite me and I would come. And so in what way am I boycotting? So that, you know, I feel, I'd like to show up and help make trouble. I'd also like to show up and brainstorm with people. And one of the things about protest moments that are so interesting to me is that you're simultaneously speeding things up and slowing things down. I'm super good at slowing things down. You know, I'm not as good at speeding things up. But I think, you know, in my work, I talk about it as showing up to withhold. You know, how do you do it? That's what a boycott is. If I don't show up, nobody knows I'm withholding. So you have to produce these infrastructures in which you show up to withhold, but you're not withholding everything because you're showing up. So the question is, you know, how do you think about the production of collaborative worlds in which it's not you showing up for an audience, but you showing up to brainstorm with people? That seems really important to me. And it's always like horizontal power, like the idea that you're trying to work out equality together in real time. It's not a status, it's a process that you do. I'm totally willing to do that. But boycotting in itself only matters if there's a screen that nobody appears on, you know? That's all.
Can I jump in with a quick comment, please? Yeah, no, I appreciate what Lauren's saying, and I want to come back to the notion of the university pretending to be a good liberal subject and the way it gets away with that by hiding all the violent shit that it does to people. I want to dwell on that and think about that in this way. I want to honor the ways in which you all strikers, particularly people that have been fired and are, you know, getting sick and hungry and shit like that because of what the university is doing. I want to honor what you're doing. I want to honor this intense moment of Black-led insurgency against police and policing in a way that foregrounds how these converging struggles are telling us perhaps that the good liberal subject is what it does. In other words, maybe the contradiction is not really a contradiction. Right? You know, the colonial, the anti-Black, the violent war-waging shit that the good liberal subject does and then covers over to pretend it's a good liberal subject, maybe that's all part of the good liberal subject. So I want to urge all of us here and elsewhere to take this as yet another moment among many, many moments in the last half millennium to listen to each other and to people who are saying, fuck the good liberal subject. Like, it's the good liberal subject is a regime that occupies and violates the wildness and endemic freedom of human beings. It's a war, right? The good liberal subject is a declaration of war against the wildness of human beings. And that's what, you know, that's why I really do appreciate the terminology of wildcat strike, because nobody wants to fuck with a wildcat. Nobody. And that danger and that wildness is exactly what I want to honor in thinking about this. To me, it's more than just a statement. It's actually a paradigm for thinking about how to build toward an analysis of the university that's also a kind of strategic set of guide points for engaging with the university, or maybe even disengaging from it in certain kinds of ways. So yeah, for me, that's entirely realistic and pragmatic, and not at all ultra leftist.
I think the question on the floor is, does the university value our intellectual labor as professors? Is that right? And I'd say there's
something like that, yeah.
If that's it, I mean, there's a difficulty that administrations have in that you don't have a university without a faculty. That's the reason why people go to the university. They can't do without us. There was a guy, Benjamin Ginsberg, wrote a wonderful book a while ago, maybe a decade ago, called The All Administration University, you know. And although his point was well taken, the exaggeration was precisely that. It's not possible to do away with the faculty, but it is very important for the administration to domesticate faculty labor and to make it seem less valuable than it actually is. So do they value our labor? I think they value our labor insofar as we please undergraduates who pay tuition and get good recommendations and people want to come. They certainly don't insofar as we're not producing, you know, this talk of the good liberal subject. I mean, I think that we're not trying to give students the expertise required to fill the jobs that already exist in the American economy. We're trying to get them to challenge what already exists and to think alternatives to it. And insofar as that very heroic, in some ways, I would say, academic labor of getting people to think and to criticize, which really is, to me, the most profound and important thing that teachers can do, that is not valued. The administration is very, very interested, I think, out of self-preservation in getting the public to perceive the university as servicing the society, as producing what, you know, reproducing, you know, what already exists. But I think that, you know, we are confronted, I think, by attention, and this relates a little bit to what Dylan was just saying. It seems to me the university, in its best mode, that is, as the teacher of critical thinking, is involved in a form of authorizing. It's involved in creating a certain discipline that limits freedom to a certain extent. I think that there is a coercive aspect to education and that we should embrace that, and that we should, in fact, restrict our argument to what kind of discipline and unfreedom do we want education to involve, not to pretend that we can eliminate that. To me, an absolute freedom from authority would not be a desirable state. This would not be politically beneficial to society. We want to authorize certain ideas rather than others, and therefore that's what we should be debating. What do we want coercively to imbue our students with? And I would suggest that one of those things is saying no, being critical. And that's easier said than done. It's a very difficult thing to do, but it's the most important thing we do. And it's political.
Anyone else on the panel wants to add to the question? Lauren, I
just want Tim to clarify what the last sentence he said was. Did you say no to being critical because that's the hardest thing to do?
Oh, no, sorry. I mean, saying no, comma, being critical. I mean, saying no to what exists. The truth is not what exists before us, you know, in a way that's the lie, because it's reality hasn't caught up to what we can imagine it might be. And that way of thinking about the world is really where the fight is. You know, again, back to the notion of a student activism that thinks that, you know, they're already there, that the real thing about school is just to be given accreditation for what people enter school already feeling and knowing. And I think that's a danger to political activism, and it's a danger to the value of the university, and it undermines the project of the university.
Anyone wants to add before we move on to Q&A? Mackenzie? Oh, okay. I have a few questions that folks sent me. And if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment, please message me privately. I can either read out your question or I can just unmute you and you can speak. So we have one question from the UK, from Warwick, where strikes, the person who sent me the question is saying that we had strikes throughout their undergraduate degree organized by UCU, as Lally was speaking about. The undergraduate degree was also characterized by student and staff protest over sexism and sexual abuse as a result of Warwick group chat scandal. And this person is returning to Warwick as a postgraduate in October and feels like they have much further to go with these issues. And the question they're posing is, how might we think of labor struggles in tandem with what might be seen as identity-based struggles for racial and sexual justice on campus? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
That's a great question. And maybe it doesn't have to be thought through the category of identity, because that gets you caught up in a whole co-opted discourse about it. But that does strike me as really important to link the what are essentially quantitative questions about, who does what, what amount of labor are you doing for what money and so on, with questions about who does the work under what conditions and so on, where those things start to become really critical, who's excluded from the possibility of doing that labor, and where one is sort of positing the perhaps slightly utopian model of a different form of life in attaching those questions to what would otherwise be, if you like, only trade union questions.
Well, interestingly, the idea of identity politics can be traced back to organizing, labor organizing. In other words, it was the notion, what were the different conditions of labor between white laborers and laborers of color? And the idea of white privilege also came out of the labor movement. And so in trying to think through these material realities, we get quite close to an authentic and very useful diagnosis of what's happening today, in which the right has continually played those two groups off of each other. Back in the 1800s, Asians could not be part of the white working man's party. So how the capital has always existed and profited out of setting groups against each other. So any kind of understanding of labor has to understand the way that race and other operations of difference have been used to break apart unity.
Well, I just want to say something because I have to go to another meeting, and it would take a really long time to be adequate to this question. But first of all, I'd like to say the actual concept of identity politics came from the Combahee River Collective, and that one of the arguments of Combahee was that you needed to bring all the different kinds of knowledge and value production that were involved in the reality of your community and the extension of your community into the domain of politics. So it was labor, it was socialism, it was sexual politics. It was African-American women, the disregard and exploitation of African-American women's labor and women's labor. So it's racial capitalism and gender capitalism, and also the sense of like, what is it that makes it possible for a group's attachment to have value as opposed to just be a kind of repurposing of injury. And so, I always would want people to go back to Combahee on this question. And then to say that it seems to me that part of the struggle that FUC and COLA have been, trying to provide platforms for thinking through, has to do with how do you bring all the different kinds of knowledge you have to the scene of the production of collective life, where the university is the figure of collective life that brought us to each other, but it's not the only figure of collective life. And I was very inspired by Fred and Stefano's presentation when they're just trying to think of the question of like, what is it that brings you together? Is it just because you wanted to be reading together? Is it because you wanted to be thinking together, or were you already together? And trying to find ways of sustaining that. So I've been thinking a lot about that. So I guess to the question, one of the things that happens is that sexual knowledges tend to be humiliated and shamed and not considered, they're considered political, but kind of in a minor way rather than essential to the extension and forms of coercion and what's the other word, intimidation. You know, the idea that there's not a generous space for you to contribute your thought to in the university. And I think I think it's really important that nobody says that kind of knowledge should wait for later, that the inconvenience of different kinds of knowledge are central to the production of the politics that we're all engaged in now. And I'm really sorry that I have other meetings to go to. I mean, for a lot of reasons, but also because I'm like dying to hear from the other questions, and I hope I get a good report from somebody after it's over. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm gonna just like sign off now. Bye. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay.
There will be a
Bye.
recording out of this session as well.
Okay, yeah, like if you talk behind my back and stuff, I'll be happy. I'll like get to experience
We'll report back too.
Thank you, and more soon. Bye-bye.
Dylan?
Yeah, with a spirit of collegiality and grace and generosity, I want to encourage a reconsideration of the premise that wants to juxtapose labor struggle versus identity-based struggle. I appreciate that Lauren brought us back to identity politics coming from the Combahee River Collective. I think most of the time when folks invoke identity-based struggles in the ways that the question invoked it, it's not necessarily referring to Combahee's notion of it. It's echoing a certain kind of relatively compartmentalized notion of identity that comes straight out of official, liberal, and institutionalized forms of multiculturalism. And which doesn't, I think, adequately appreciate how it is that, again, the work that people are doing in campus strikes and Black-led uprisings against domestic warfare. And I want to bring up the other example of prison strikes, right? That all these things are destroying that distinction between the sociality and the being that people inhabit, this thing we call identity, and their bodies, their work, their labor, and either their possession, their expropriation, or their exploitation, right? All those distinctions go away because it is one modality of survival, suffering, and struggle. And that's what each of these kind of, again, overlapping versions of struggle, insurgency, and revolt, right? The UC strikes, Black-led insurgency against policing, prison strikes. I'm thinking about prison strikes in Pelican Bay in California, in the largest prison labor strike in US history in Georgia, which was not that long ago. Other prison strikes where in some places they're Black-led, other places they're Brown-led, other places it's in a kind of explicit coalition of people who are saying we need to put our beef aside, our and whatnot, because we are inhabiting one position here as captives who are possessions of the state and who are subject to the logic of involuntary servitude. We're not necessarily, whether or not their labor is being exploited, we are subject to the logic of involuntary servitude, meaning slavery. I think part of the moment we're in is also urging us to address these, I think, oftentimes or usually, I would say, not very productive, if not undermining, distinctions between struggles based on work, labor, and exploitation, and struggles that are based on so-called identity. So let's think about how it is that these fights that we and others are engaged in are refusing that. And again, the analytic is so important here because the analytic guides the organizing strategy, it guides the writing, it guides the critique, it guides kind of the historical script that we're narrating as we live it. So I want to push back against that distinction. And it always does come back, I forgot who already said it, but it always comes back to the way Cedric Robinson teaches us about racial capitalism, right? That tribal, proto-racial warfare is as the condition of possibility for capitalism, is the condition of possibility for the formation of coherent, class distinctions, that those things are endemic to the way capitalism works. This alleged irrationality is actually endemic to the way capitalism has always worked. So I hear folks, citing racial capitalism all the time, but there still is this kind of tendency to fall back on, a kind of non-racial notion of capitalism, in which notions of the inhabitation of anti-Black violence and racial colonial violence are kind of compressed into identity-based struggles. So let's please question that. That's all I ask.
Thank you. I got a comment that, for point of information, there's an ongoing prison uprising in Georgia right now, and I'm going to drop a link to a Twitter feed about this to everyone. While we're on this question, anyone wants to add? Should we move on?
Maybe just a small point, and that's, I think that we're trying to think through together collectively some of the ways in which organizing might bear fruit within the specific context of the university as graduate students and as professors. It seems to me that the specificity of the university demands that we recognize that people who go to graduate school are involved in a form of professional accreditation. Okay, so their radical political beliefs, insofar as they have them, and I think that the default position of graduate students in the humanities, in my experience at least, is nominally, verbally radical. I don't think anybody is an exception to that. It's very rare, at any rate. But this unseemly linkage, that is difficult to avoid and uncomfortable to talk about between the process of professionalization and becoming, hopefully, a viable candidate for a good academic job within and under the conditions of American capitalism, which, of course, influenced the university like any other large corporation. That linkage between that and a radical rhetoric of difference is sometimes a danger zone. It sometimes produces outcomes that are undesirable and unwilled and even involuntary, but it also doesn't necessarily lead in the direction that one would expect it to on the surface of things. So I think we have to understand, that the university, however unique it is as an institution within society, is also one where the specific forms of labor have to be analyzed according to their lights, and that it isn't symbolically projectable, if I can say that word, to other forms of labor struggle. It's a little bit different. This would mean, I think, among other things, that we should take the intellectual content of what we do more seriously. That is, it seems to me not apolitical and not merely a prolegomenon to acquaint ourselves not only with the history of earlier campus organizing. I mentioned the Marcuse writings that Angela Davis talks about in her memoirs, but also the Adorno and Marcuse debate over student activism, and the Leslie Evans wonderful book that is all about student organizing in the 60s and 70s. It's called Outsider's Reverie, and other things like that, to kind of acquaint ourselves with that, but also to know something more about, if we don't already know, about works like Zone Rettel's intellectual and manual labor, and the whole question of intellectual labor. I think that this needs to be theorized, and it's not irrelevant to the immediate practices of student organizing around COLA and so on.
Thank you. I want to encourage our audience to message me with comments as well as questions. If you want to add to the discussion, you're very welcome. We're going to have Natalie ask a question. I'm just going to unmute them.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I am a fired Wildcat at UCSC along with Yulia and Tony. And I don't know, this might be one of those more of a comment than a question, but I guess what I'm thinking through is, it's interesting having this panel with full professors who, came to this profession at a different time and during different conditions. And I feel right now that the reason that especially those in the social sciences and humanities grad students were so quick to go on strike after really just an email chain that went around that Stephen, who's also on this call, sent out. A lot of the reason is because we don't feel we have any future. So what you're talking about, Tim, about professionalization and the way that that plays out with radical politics, I feel like it's playing out in a really different way when you consider that most of us know that we will not be able to get a tenure track position. Most of us know we will barely be able to survive in an adjunct position. That is the future that we're looking at. We are not thinking in the same way that the previous generation was thinking about professionalization. So I guess I just want to sort of bring up that point and sort of ask how we deal with that kind of, it almost feels like a generational divide in what the possibility of the university is for us. And maybe the reason that, Yulia and Tony both use the phrase abolition of the university is because the university that exists now is not one that is going to be possible for us to make a home in. And so we're not talking about destroying education altogether. I think we feel deeply committed to education, to learning, to thinking together, to conversation, just like this, but we're talking about creating a different kind of university that makes life possible.
I totally hear that. I think there has been a inflection point in what the possibilities of work in the university are, and this is past it. I mean, I feel like I was actually tenured twice. The second time was only in 2007. And even that feels like a little bit of a different universe to where we are now. There was this sense of kicking the can down the road in terms of how the sort of debt-based model of education will work in the United States. But yeah, I totally get that. I think the sort of full subsumption of university under a form of kind of commodification of information is really the moment that we're at. And institutions will take COVID as a kind of excuse to really accelerate that. So it's a very important time to be organizing really as labor, but then also I think not to be entirely pessimistic about it, but to keep open that utopian possibility that there could be another model of what learning is.
I really appreciate your comments, Natalie. I think it's a really important point you make. It's kind of a mixed situation though, isn't it? I mean, at least in, I teach at the University of Minnesota. It's not a first-tier school, but a lot of the people in our small program, we only admit, I think, 4 graduate students a year. They get jobs. So they still get jobs. So I think that there are, of course, people entering the program, and we're very frank about this. I just taught the basic seminar, which is a required seminar. And I polled the students who were coming in about whether they were in this to get an academic job or whether they were in it for the ideas themselves, whether they get an academic job or not. And most of them answered the latter, that they didn't expect to get one because the odds were against it. But I think that my point about professionalization is still valid up to a point, in that a lot of people think they might be the ones who get it because people are getting jobs out of our program. So I am totally behind the rethinking of the university to accommodate the crisis that everybody is experiencing and feeling about the future, and that's a very, very good point. But I don't think it completely mitigates the idea that I was getting at, which is that people in that situation are combining 2 very different things, right? They're driven to radicalism in part because of their declining prospects, but they're also involved in the hope that they will be one of the few who get the job.
Could I add on to that?
Yeah.
Because it also gets to a question that I'm asking myself, and I think others have asked me, which is why haven't more tenured professors signed on to the boycott? And what's going on there? What happens as you... but Natalie, I invite you and anybody else to email me, because this morning, just a couple of hours ago, our department was asked, how do we want to handle grades in terms of graduate students? And one proposition was, well, let's just say that they have to get a B, blah, 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 rather than satisfactory or credit. And I objected to that, and I can send you my objections and the reason why, which is that you're exactly right. Faculty, I mean, I'm way old, but even people have no idea what student life is. And I was just on another call about this. Faculty have no idea what student life is like. Undergraduates' life, and most especially graduate life. I said, graduate students are TAing, holding other jobs, or both. They are losing housing. They have family responsibilities. They often have dependents. And sure, you know, we as a graduate student, we had some of those issues, but never in this historical matrix that we're suffering under now. And with the I said, dismal prospects of the future, although, you know, Timothy's right, people are getting jobs, but jobs are also being waived or frozen because no economy can sustain the expectation that you can hire somebody with tenure. I mean, hire somebody into a tenure track position, which is always the guarantee of possible, not guarantee, but the notion that that job is there in perpetuity for somebody. So what happens as people get older? When you're starting off as a graduate student or assistant professor, you're working for somebody else. You're working for approval, you're working for tenure. Your scholarship is pegged toward other people's expectations. After you get tenure, you're given this freedom, which I think you should have, which is you write your own stuff. You write things that are fulfilling for you, that are hopefully useful to society. But it goes into this weirdly contradictory space of self-interest, right? You are more free to be self-interested than ever before. And you get Guggenheims or whatever, and you start, you know, becoming your own brand. And you get further and further removed from the whole process of education, which, as Dylan said, should be critical, should be questioning the things that you finally are able to question in a free way. And you basically start to buy into the logic of the institution because you start to identify with it. It's rewarded you, so it can't be bad. And so you are hesitant to raise any kinds of objections. I, on the other hand, was hired because of a student strike. Students took over the president's office. They went on hunger strike. They wanted ethnic studies. So when I came to Stanford, I pretty much told people what to expect, but I'm unusual in that way. And I was frankly privileged in that way. But my heart goes out to you and everybody else who cares about knowledge, who cares about learning, you're all giving so much energy and passion and money that you don't have into a system that is only going to recognize you on a very narrow spectrum, if that. And I am disappointed in my colleagues because of that, of buying into the institution. We become so entranced by it because it's benefited us. And the only way to break that is to have more people like, you know, Timothy and Mackenzie and Dylan and Lauren out there showing up essentially and holding people responsible.
Thank you, David. I've got a few comments. One, making the point that just a reminder that the casualization of academic labor has begun since the 90s. And the person who made the comment to me, their generation of 98 had very few options at the time already. And those with tenure know that half of their class at that time did not get jobs in the academy. So there are generations or two of contingent faculty and adjuncts to draw on. And I just wanted also to make a point that we do have some exceptional tenured faculty who were incredibly supportive throughout the strike, but how much support and solidarity we've got from lecturers is really incredible. And that's the people who are more precarious than us, who have less job security than us, who make just as little money as graduate workers do, and may just not get rehired. Instead of, you know, we have the union behind us, and, you know, us getting fired has some sort of, yeah.
But that's a great point, because it's a matter, again, of who do you identify with, you know, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add to this part of the discussion as well, real quick? I want to talk, I'm in the last days of my terminal second term as the chair of our academic senate at UC Riverside. So I involuntarily earned like a second PhD in administrative rhetoric, jargon, and power mapping in the last 4 years over these two terms. And I want to say something about this because I want to really pay close attention to what Natalie was getting at, which is this: the university. What I've found in reflecting on these last 4 years is that the university, in particular, the public research university, is fundamentally unsustainable in this moment. I think it's always been fundamentally unsustainable, but it is particularly and acutely unsustainable in this moment. This public research university does not have a future that in any way resembles its historical normativities. Those are the contradictions that you see popping up all the time. That's why the University of California still doesn't call it tuition. They call them fees because at its foundations, there was supposed to be tuition free back when it was basically an all white and overwhelmingly male undergraduate population, if not, graduate and faculty population. So what we're actually in right now is we're seeing the university imploding in real time. And this is what administrators are dealing with pretty much every day. They don't use the terms of implosion, but that's what's happening. It's imploding in real time. It's of its own making, of course. But this is not, it is a morbid statement. I do intend it as a morbid statement, right? Because that shit is destructive, and the non-futurity that Natalie's talking about for grad students is profound. Like, I mean, all the grad students that I've been working with and are working with now, that is the thing front and center every hour of every day is will I have a job in this chosen profession? Am I gonna have to go outside the so-called academy? Like, what am I doing? What is the future? So the whole kind of precarity of futurity itself is a deep thing. Having said that, because the university is imploding in real time, we have to understand this as an opportunity to make a radical series of sustainable interventions on the university in every possible way, right? And this is done through strikes, of course. It's done through all kinds of critical work that happen within and against the institution, particularly for those that are exploited and employed by it. But I think we have to see that implosion as the right type of crisis, right? That this is not just a crisis that's going to fuck up our research funds and force us to give up 5% of our salaries for those of us that are privileged enough to have a ladder rank or tenured position. It's not just that. It's actually the paradigm of the public research university is in the middle of falling apart as we speak. And of course, the ones who suffer the most for it are students and staff. But in terms of embracing a politics within this historical kind of impasse, I think acknowledging that the possibilities within this real-time implosion is really critical. We got to understand that's again what the UC Santa Cruz Wildcat strikers, I think, brought into sharp relief. It made it undeniable that the university is no longer sustainable. It should even their chancellor's response to the strike made that clear, right? Like, this shit cannot continue. Not to mention the way that administrations are responding to abolitionist and proto-abolitionist movements against the presence of university police. It's all demonstrating that the present tense of the university there's no tomorrow for this. So the question is how we inhabit this kind of dangerous and beautiful place that we're in.
Natalie, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it reflects what's happening in the world at large. It's not only about the university, it's about the fact that the world is ending. Most people my generation there's like a meme that was going around. It's like, I don't expect to own a home or retire because I'm going to die in the climate wars. So this is really like kind of the attitude of my generation. And it's not just graduate students, it's really, really widespread. And I think when you know there's no future for you, when you know that capitalism and the systems within capitalism, including the university, have failed you, will fail all of your friends, it really allows a kind of openness and freedom that I think for many in the university seems to not be so possible. I feel like a lot of my professionalization has been being told what is not possible, being told what is not reasonable, being told the limits of the university. And so I think what the Wildcat is bringing and what, Wildcats across the country right now are bringing is an expansion of what might be possible.
I think if I can add to that, Natalie, it's worth saying at this event that I really think faculty can go on strike. You know, through the struggle, faculty and the UC did not go on strike. There was like a survey that went around, and like a number of people said that they would, but they didn't get the numbers. But I think there was always like a kind of defeatism. I think because, you know, the faculty organized their campus, they're awesome, but they were always up against like this extreme kind of conservatism from the other side. But I think the struggle, because it was so big and it involved everybody, and there was so much like you know, reflection and thinking that went on through it, that I think the possibilities are there. And like, if there's going to be any time for the conditions to make a strike possible, it's now. You know, we've had these huge uprisings, and you know, the university is going to be demanding things of us like incredibly dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the COVID makes precarity of precarious workers and precarious students so much more acute. And I think the uprising against the police violence and police state, and like the fights against police presence on campuses, also make the questions of safety and who feels safe and who feels at home on campus so much more acute. And if we want to change the conditions of that, I think we cannot do that without faculty going on strike. So yeah, now feels like the time. I'm gonna read one comment, and then I'm gonna unmute Amy for a question. So the comment is about the competitive environment of graduate programs that is under-considered and rarely critiqued, but it is a vestige of the open system of many jobs opening from the 70s. And the moment we're in now requires new methods, including an end to indefinite tenure, stopping annual salary increases with seniority, and so on. So that's the comment that I got from the audience. And I'm gonna unmute Amy for their question.
Hi, yeah. So I'm also based in the UK. I'm an associate lecturer at University of Exeter, which is in the Southwest. And I'm also one of the organizers of something called Corona Contract, which is a campaign on a national scale to demand contract extensions for precarious workers during the pandemic. So you can follow us on Corona Contract if you want to check out some of what we're doing. I'm going to ask a question, but I'll try to answer what we've been doing. And then maybe if you guys have more things that you can add that you think we should be doing, it would be really useful. Or if there's things like different perspectives that you can contribute. I'll say, first of all, it's been incredibly inspiring and important to watch the struggle unfold from the UK all the way back from 2018. And I think in a lot of ways we've had to like see this and our solidarity with you as like a kind of learning experience for us in terms of both how you've related to the union, to UAW 2865, to the struggles within that, you know, to try to pull them into a broader strike, that, and also in terms of like the contract vote in 2018 as well, which again could have gone a different way, and we've just rejected an offer which puts us in a slightly different position, almost as if we're where you all were in 2018 but managed to reject that offer. So we are facing a potential strike at some point during this year, like a national union. UCU could potentially go on strike if we manage to organize that properly. And we're seeing the same exact counter arguments, like almost like copy pasted, like citing Jane McAlevey and saying we don't have enough density, and like it's bizarre. But what I'm trying to think about are ways in which particularly we need to foreground and retain a lot of the people who are losing their jobs, and also to make sure that we are reaching across unions, particularly because there's the potential for other major unions to take serious strike action in the UK, particularly after the pandemic. There's going to be big NHS rallies tomorrow, for example, which I'm hopefully going to go to. And there have been nurses and other NHS workers saying that they're potentially willing to go on strike after all the government has done to them during the pandemic. So I'm going to say, like, what we have attempted to do has been to do a lot of grassroots organizing, to put it, to put pressure on our union, to call out all the different occasions when there have been walkouts, when there have been grassroots actions, and we're going to try to kind of form like a grassroots body. What we haven't been able to do, however, has been to get the union to make promises to workers who are becoming unemployed, whether that's promoting, there is an unemployed membership. If you become unemployed, you can technically remain a union member. But for some reason, our union has chosen not to promote that and not to kind of make advertisements, possibly because they think they don't want to promote that people are becoming unemployed. But that's the reality. The fungibility of precarious labor is like part of what we're dealing with. So part of what we were thinking was try to get somebody who would be like an unemployed organizer or somebody who would focus on that and try to bring those people into the union. And also potentially thinking about, as a strike tactic, if we do go on strike, making sure that we do strike schools where we offer educational provision and have people who are not on a university contract, potentially people like yourselves, offering education and making it clear to students that we literally don't need management. We run our own classes. We run, like you can teach a class that's just as good and you're not on a university payroll if you're an unemployed worker. And so I think that's part of what we're trying to pitch. But we've had a lot of kind of inaction from our union, and we've always had to like tactically kind of make sure that we both try to take them over in as much as we can on a branch by branch basis, but also try to push them in whatever ways we can. But I wonder if you guys have any creative ideas about thinking about unemployment and thinking about people who are part of the university, hugely part of the university, who probably will potentially get contracts again in the future and kind of go in and out of these cycles of unemployment or precarious employment or multiple contracts. How do we kind of include that and foreground that in our struggle, and how do we keep those people involved, I guess is one of my questions.
Anyone wants to jump in? I'll say one thing, that this series, as well as the platform that's called Strike University, was organized first by UC Berkeley graduate workers who were gonna go on strike and whose day one of the picket coincided with COVID-19 and moving all of the university functions online. So there was no operations to disrupt in person. And so all of the teach-ins and all of the like radical education that those strikers imagined they would offer at the picket line, they pushed it online. And so they created this platform that's called Strike University that reimagines or sort of radicalizes what education is and like what a public education is. And who is welcome in those spaces, and like the questions, the sort of credibility of different sources, and like who can teach and who can lead a session. So I think the idea of like having those teach-ins and sort of radical spaces for education and alternative spaces for education is really important. Anyone wants to jump in?
The one thing I've noticed being very effective in New York City, and I see it through trans women, but there are other networks, is mutual aid. And so if you're dealing with populations in different states of the cycle of precarity, to link them so that people are like directly helping each other as the platform to then build a kind of a consciousness and solidarity on top of that.
I think it's maybe worth saying that Amy and we were on an organizing call not too long ago. It's good to see you again. But that like kind of since everything has gone online, we've had a number of these conversations with people at Exeter, people at King's College London, Goldsmiths, Columbia, at Oregon State University. So like these kinds of conversation and organizing conversations are enabled in this time, and that we it allows us to like share teach-ins and like steal resources from the university and put them on platforms that are accessible to everybody. I mean, the other thing is that kind of in terms of precarious workers, like lecturers in our case, who are just working like shorter contracts. This is like always a really difficult problem of having communication with everybody, because they're, you know, working at different times. They have the different institutions that they're involved with. That's a like organizing problem to keep thinking through, I think.
I mean, this is really complicated because there's so many differences from institution to institution. I'm hearing you all with a certain amount of envy that there's a faculty union, for example, that could go on strike, presumably, and could join in solidarity with your graduate student struggle. I mean, I was involved in a union effort. It was the second large effort at the University of Minnesota about 2 or 3 years ago. The SEIU had come in. There was a state law that had originally interpreted adjunct labor, contract laborers, as being in the same bargaining unit as tenured faculty, which was an enormous boon and obviously gave us a really good chance of winning the election. So we went through it, all the dirty practices that you can imagine administrations were pulled. And eventually, with their huge legal resources, they went to an appeals court in Minnesota and got this ruling overturned. So to separate these two bargaining units, and the union went down in flames. So I'm raising this in part to say that my experience trying to organize that union with others was dismaying at a number of levels, and that it was really made clear to me the different constituencies in the university that do not perceive themselves having the same interests as others. So I'm in a very, very large college, by far the largest college in the university, called College of Liberal Arts, which includes economics, and it includes all of the social sciences as well as the humanities. And it was very clear to me that the social scientists, not all of them obviously, but many of them, didn't perceive their interests as being with the union, because the union would put us all on the same footing, whereas now they're sort of given preferential treatment when it comes to funding in the university. All the named professorships go to them and they get an extra funding. There's even 2 associate deans in the College of Liberal Arts, one for the humanities, one for the social sciences. So there's that. There's also the very common sort of procedure that faculty members of a certain type, and I was quite surprised to find who they were and who they weren't, you know, don't think of themselves as labor and never want to think of themselves as labor. It degrades their profession, et cetera, et cetera. And so they felt that their future lay with private deals cut with the dean and not with collective bargaining. So I think that, you know, as we try to sort of, you know, adjudicate and find ways of helping each other and thinking about organizing, that one of the things that we should think about are the different constituencies in the university to have a really clear analysis of their different interests, and to try to find, without being utopian and idealistic, to try to find real material means of establishing a foundation for solidarity once those material interests are taken into account. Secondly, there's nothing, you know, inevitable about the lack of funding in the current university that makes the labor so precarious, right? I mean, this is a long-term strategy on the part of state legislatures to defund public education because they consider it an expense rather than an investment. So I think that whatever this is worth, you know, in addition to the kind of nuts and bolts organizing question of an analysis of different interests in our organizing units, that we also think about going to the public more. The administrations are bloated. They're parasitic in their relationship to the university. Many of them are who fill the administration have no background in education. They're simply there because of the money that comes in the form of student loans. It's a big pot of money, and it's a big advertising freebie, right? They've got captive audience, and there's all kinds of money to be made with you know, contracts, outsourcing, and so on. So I think that to expose the administration and administrative bloat while making a case to the public for what the university is a long-term strategy, but an important part of whatever we do as organizers to increase the amount of funding that comes from the state to the universities. It's a long-term fight, but I don't see it really ever being a fair fight without our doing that.
Could I just add on to what Timothy said, because he really touched on an important topic. And I encourage you to look at the work of Chris Newfield and others who've really exposed exactly what a sham this is, because there's certainly money. And there's a total lack of transparency, even within public universities. And just one short, and this gets back to something that Lale said in her presentation, which is, we went into the fight when we were doing the divestment fight, and we're also the fight to close the Stanford Press. We were trying to wonder, we were wondering where the money goes. And so Stanford has this thing called the Stanford Management Company, all the, a dozen people with, making all the investments. On top of them, we have a sort of stealth group of consultants that they hire. And we delved into the finances. These people were paid $700 million a year for, adding on. So it's a scheme, and it's decidedly used to basically make profits at the expense of the educational mission. I can't put it any more strongly. So I think Timothy's exactly right, and this is where we get back to the idea of the university, whether it's private or public, but being a public good. Whether it's private or public, it is a public good. It's producing knowledge at a time when we have a huge campaign of disinformation. I mean, it's one of the most important spaces politically for that, if nothing else. I have to jump off to be on another call. I really thank you for inviting me. Please, anybody who wants to, I'd love to stay in communication with all of you. DM me on Twitter, email me. I hope we continue to do these kinds of things, and I give you my absolute solidarity. So thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Dylan, did you want to say a few words about the links that?
Yeah, thanks for posting them, Yulia. This is a small gesture, but I think a potentially productive and I don't know, for lack of a better term, invigorating, empowering, collective one. But one of the positions I've taken on is as president of the American Studies Association. And back when the pandemic first started was around the same time we were organizing for the annual meeting that's now been basically postponed in terms of the in-person part. And one of the projects that we collectively decided to take on as a program committee is this thing called Freedom Courses. And I'll be honest with you all, I'll be transparent that probably 50% of what motivated doing these Freedom Courses, which are different varieties of recorded, free, online accessible, basically political education sessions on specific topics organized by regular folks, not even necessarily American Studies Association members, right? So part of this is an invitation to everybody on this call to do one. Click on the link, you'll see what the spirit of it is. The format is not limited to webinars like this. You can do podcasts, you can curate like an art exhibit, you can do a spoken word. I don't care what you do, but something that's in the spirit of doing this kind of praxis, right? That's liberated from the kind of conventions and constraints of the university and actually draws from a sense of radical community and creative community. But 50% of the reasons that we were doing this during the time was this is when almost everyone's teaching went to remote online teaching in an emergency way, and people were immediately exhausted by it. So frankly, we wanted to put some stuff out there and post it that people could just use to give themselves a week off of lecturing on Zoom, right? To just show this shit to their students, maybe have a discussion section around what was there for the Freedom Course instead of doing this online in-person Zoom teaching. So part of it was to kind of accumulate a good archive of classroom accessible type material. But some of the questions y'all have raised here and some of the kind of micro discussions that we're having, I know in chat as well as out loud, could very quickly be turned into a Freedom Course. So click on that link. I'll take a look at what's there. There's more coming up. There's the fifth one's about to come up, and there's a bunch more in the planning stages now. But all y'all can just hit me up with an email. I think the Gmail's up there, my ASA Gmail. Hit me up with that, and we can talk about it. But I encourage y'all to do that, and that'll kind of actually, exemplify the kind of creative and potentially radical knowledge production, creative work, collective work that we're talking about here.
Thank you. There are quite a few more questions, and I'm going to try to get through at least a couple. I'm going to unmute Edda. Did that work?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I have the head speakers on. I'm a third year PhD student in UCSC from the anthropology department. I went on a Wildcat strike in January, I think, when we first started. And I have a few comments about our labor power, openness and freedom that Natalie mentioned about, and the undergrad involvement in the strike. One of the things that was most surprising to me when we first started on strike was the undergrad presence. And in terms of talking about organizing, strategizing, and the revolutionary power or evolution of the university, I think we have to take into account the undergrad involvement. And we wouldn't be able to withhold grades without undergrads supporting us. Like, I was staying for a class with 300 undergrad students. I was one-on-one teaching at least like 40 students. And I think this is the unaccounted, like, our space and our place in the classroom is the unaccounted place that admin doesn't see. Like, of course, there is a prestigious point to getting a degree or whatsoever, but admin doesn't have one-to-one relationships with students, which we had. And students always look up to their TAs and their professors. And when we were picketing, most of the people who showed up were undergrads. And I think in terms of like thinking about any kind of utopian or revolutionary place in the university, this is like our little labor access that admin doesn't care about. All they cared about was us submitting the grades, but they didn't care about what we teach, how we teach, and the relationship that we had with our undergrads. And what makes most of a university is undergrads. And I think, I mean, this is not a question, I'm sorry, but my comment is that in terms of organizing, we always have to take into account undergrads, because those are also people, I mean, especially the undergrads in social sciences programs, I think they very much understand how precarious their position is. They're getting into debt without a guarantee of getting a job. So like if you would be an undergrad in an engineering program, maybe you would give into the prestigious like idea of getting a degree, but for people in social sciences, they're pretty much aware of their precarious position. And I think this like alliance that we can have with undergrads is the place to start planning about any kind of revolutionary or like, I mean, the evolutionist group that came out of our strike movement at the UCSC came from undergrads and people of color students. So yeah. Sorry, that's not a question, but this is, yeah, what I thought that is the unaccounted part of, like, this is the only space that we have one-on-one in classrooms, is the place that we don't have the admin in. And also it plays into the idea of education and what we understand from an education, I think.
Although can I just point out that if we end up teaching over Zoom and things like that this coming semester, that you're actually not in a private space with students anymore.
Yes.
And just a little aware of that. And not to be paranoid about it, but just to be a little bit aware of that.
It was one of the things that I was most sad about the last quarter, that I wasn't able to have one-on-one the relationship with my students, because I know how much that mattered. I mean, of course, it's like a power relationship between you and students, because there's like an hegemony between you and the professor and the TA and the student. But also, like, because of this weird power relationship, because they look up to you, they really take seriously what you are telling to them. Like when you tell them that I'm going on strike because of such and such reasons, undergrads really do take you seriously, like most of them.
I'm pointing to something a bit more specific, which is that if your university has institutional Zoom, it has access to all the aggregate data from every class.
Yeah.
And also the ability to see and record what's going on in your class.
Exactly. It is definitely a loss that we had by having classrooms over Zoom. I mean, there's nothing to do about it. There's a pandemic. But the thing that we lost, I think most, was this like one-on-one relationship that we had with students.
I think it's worth like highlighting what it does, saying though about, you know, when we went, all of the discipline that we've received basically has, the majority of the worst has been for the grading strike, for grades not being received, rather than when later we went on a teaching strike, basically, like, nobody has been disciplined for the content of what happened in their classes at all, I think, across the entire UC.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it seems like the university doesn't really care so much about what happens in those spaces. But it's worth addressing what you're saying, Mackenzie. Yeah.
I'm gonna unmute Ben for your comment.
Hi, hope you all can hear me. Thank you for all these great remarks. And I try and ask something, question that's coherent, but it's going to probably border on incoherence. So I'm a laid off adjunct. As we're seeing around the systems, the use of adjunct labor or lecturers is the pressure release valve, right? We can simply not be reappointed. So we are also seeing some retraction among tenured faculty as well. And obviously this is affecting graduate student admissions, right? And I think we'll see work speed ups across the board for those folks who do remain. And I guess I kind of want to actually bring the question back to this relationship to labor in the university, and in particular the division of labor, which for some reason I think we've kind of erased that middle point. That is the graduate student who fails to professionalize and fails to get a tenure line job, but does then do the labor of the university in the classroom. And I particularly want to kind of press on the idea of the relationship between teaching and research, right? Which is a naturalized relationship on one hand, but then is used as a sorting mechanism on the other, right? And so I kind of want to ask, particularly for those of y'all who are on the tenure line and the fact that, or even tenured, and are understanding this boycott as a labor action, rightly, whether there's any consideration of thinking about your research is also labor, right? That is refusals to do that kind of work, right? Because I think this is where the whole sort of subjectifying work of graduate school and intellectual life comes to a head, right? Because there is a certain refusal to give up that part which our identities are so tied up with. As Tim has said, right, there is a way we think of that relationship between our politics and our research that binds us very closely to it. And so the idea of sacrificing or refusing to do that labor, I feel like rarely gets talked about, rarely even gets opened up. And the other portion of this that kind of ties into that is that this has also been part of the facilitation of faculty into the administrative work, right? The policing that Dylan talked about, right? Insofar as for an adjunct, tenure line faculty are in fact our managers. And this has been used in legal ways to bar the formation of unions, right? Because if you can't be in the same union as your manager who can hire and fire you, right? So I guess like part of what I want to ask is, what are those other sorts of things that people can refuse to do that are labor, that are rarely put on the table? That is, whether it be research and publication, but also that administrative work, right? Where is there any movement for that? Is there any space for those kinds of labor actions that could be taken? Thank you.
It seems to me the administration and the Republican legislators and probably the media as well would be really happy if we gave up writing essays and books. They don't want what we have to say be said. So I don't know if it would be the kind of action that would help the cause very much. It might be symbolically more consistent, I suppose, for the reasons that you're giving. But it seems to me that although lip service is given at my university, which is a tier 1 research university, to research as being an essential component of the job description. In practice, what really matters to the administration is teaching alone. And that's, so I guess I would try to think again about resorting to not writing our essays and books as a form of political protest. It seems to me that we don't want to do that, but maybe other people have other ideas.
Dylan, Mackenzie?
I mean, the thing about, things like strike action is it's got to happen at the port or the railhead And as someone has already pointed out, you know, like not putting the grades in is the port or railhead of this kind of labor. So it's like the strike matters at those points. And sort of solidarity strikes with that are kind of important for all sorts of other reasons. And a mass strike is a whole other thing, but the identifying the crucial point. And research in the humanities is just not it, you know, it's just not. It's kind of a luxury good that you're allowed to have on certain kinds of faculty line. It's very, very much about teaching in fields such as mine.
Right. I mean, there's a mentality that we have to face too, as well, which is that for quite understandable reasons, there's a kind of ressentiment, right, that arises. It's hard not to have it, you know, that students in the current generation look to the faculty members who have tenure and they go, well, they've got it made. You know, that's the kind of job I want. I want them to leave that job so that I can fill that job, you know, that kind of thinking. Whereas it seems to me, and this is kind of related to what I was saying before about any good strike action or any good labor action has to really analyze closely the different constituencies that are working in tandem in an ideal situation to produce the desired outcome. That this danger, I would say, of an antagonistic relationship being perceived between faculty and graduate students is to me counterproductive. I mean, I know maybe it's self-serving of me to say that because I'm a faculty member, but I think that a lot of our struggle, you know, as faculty members is to ensure that we don't lose any more tenure track lines, you know, because we realize that that's going to just exacerbate the situation where most of the teaching is done through contract labor, right, through adjuncts. And so we're trying to preserve what exists and to expand it, to make greater, you know, a greater number of tenure track lines. That is the greatest gift that we can, the greatest act of solidarity that we can think of towards graduate students, to ensure that the profession survives and that there are good, legitimate, decent positions to fill for the next generation. That's our struggle. So it seems to me that, yeah, go ahead, jump in.
I've been chair 3 times and an associate dean. So, yeah, you know, I've actually been on both sides of this. And I'm proud of having created, you know, in a small institution, 10 full-time lines, most of them tenured. Some in arts fields not, but that's a whole other separate conversation.
Fantastic.
The thing is, I don't know if that's still the place we're at in terms of whether this is really a kind of inflection point where that's even possible, given on the one side a sort of debt-based model of how people would come to university. The fact that enrollments in the United States have declined in undergraduate level since 2011. So it's very hard to make the case for lines when the overall pool of students, and this is even before COVID, was in decline. So I think you're up against a kind of systematic crisis, you know, with that. But apart from that, what you're advocating is what I've been trying to do for, you know, like 15 years at the New School. I just don't know if we keep doing that.
Because of COVID or because of something else?
No, the long-term trend line was very, very bad before we even got to COVID. And that's where it really, you know, falls off a cliff, I fear.
Right. I'm mindful of the time. I see Dylan and Ben having their hands up. Do you want to make your comments?
Just really quick, I want to clarify something. What I'm interested in is the structural function of publication as a sorting mechanism, right? So you can open more tenure lines, but given the scarcity economics of the university, publication, as much as we like to think of it as producing knowledge, is currently functioning within that scarcity model, right? So I think the idea of the inflection point has to be put in that context. What is its structural role right now? Because I think, Tim, well, I agree, sure, Republicans don't like what you publish, but you really think they read what you publish? To be honest, few people read most of the publications, right? It would, in fact, be the teaching that they don't like, and which is what Mackenzie's point, I think, is really well taken when we move to these platforms where now they can actually look at what we're teaching, right? That is scary. That is agreed an inflection point, but I do think that if we think about the role of scholarship as a structural element of the institution, I think we need to be a little bit more open to questioning how it functions. That's all.
Yeah, I want to agree with that point and push it forward in a certain way. in one sense, I want to say that we need to understand how it is that there's academic scholarship and there's scholarship in the larger, robust, flourishing sense of scholarship, right? And for many centuries, entire categories of peoplehood, personhood, had no access to the academy to kind of as an infrastructure to house and canonize and whatever, circulate its knowledge production. And then there's a moment in which there became some partial access to the academy or the university to do that work. And a lot of us still sit in that tension, right? And what I think Ben is bringing up here brings that tension into really sharp relief again, which is to say that to the extent that insurgent forms of knowledge production, insurgent forms of scholarship are always subjected to the appropriation and commodification of the university research kind of bean counting apparatus, right? And therefore they become less insurgent. They become less effective. They become really kind of cosplay at social transformation, rebellion, and revolution. They become a kind of empty performance of it rather than a deep and meaningful and collective performance of it. So what I try to struggle to do, I'm just putting myself in this now because I'm part of this whole fucked up dynamic that Ben is talking about, right? I'm in it as much as not more than almost anybody on this call. What I think needs to be a commitment for scholars that are generating knowledge. Number one, we're not going to stop doing our work, right? We're not going to stop doing, meaning our praxis, not our academic labor. I'm talking about the work we do as thinkers, as teachers, as writers, as practitioners, as theorists, all that shit. The question is whether we can find ways to do it that are accountable to a collective, whether you want to call it a social movement, whether it's an organization, whether it's an intellectual artistic movement of some kind. If you can continue to write and generate knowledge and pedagogy that is accountable to a collective struggle of some kind, right? That's something I'll do for the rest of my life, right? Whether I'm employed by a university or not. And it's that distinction that I think we need to harp on and dwell in and move in all the time, especially now. Because what it does is it shows us that the university is, in a sense, it's just another infrastructure, right? It's an important one in many ways, but it's just another infrastructure. We don't actually need, to echo Ben's point, we don't actually need the university. We don't actually need the academy to do this work and this scholarship. So part of this means, for those of us that are in a tenured position, to start pushing your writing, your scholarship, and your thinking out into different kinds of venues, to maybe not adhere to the same traditional academic formula for circulating your work, to collaborate and do collective forms of thought and work, and I think this can't be emphasized enough, and to also engage in forms of scholarship and creative and cultural and textual production that uplift your students, right? I was about to say younger scholars. I don't want to be ageist because some scholars, they come to grad school when they're at a different stage in life. So I'm talking about students need to be uplifted in that collective fashion, right? So we need to, people that are in my generation, we need to stop just citing each other in the same generation, right? We need to actually be working with our grad students' dissertations and other grad students' dissertations and putting that stuff out there as part of a broader community of praxis. I mean, that's the bare minimum, right? But I do think it's meaningful. I'll say that. I do think that that's a meaningful way to kind of push back against these logics of commodification. But this is a minute by minute ongoing struggle. And I think that the different forms of subversion, resistance, insurgency against that need to proliferate. So I'm just embracing Ben's question.
Thank you. I know we're past the time. I'm gonna unmute Samasa for the last question. I'm sorry, everyone whose questions we didn't get to. We have so many excellent questions and comments. And hopefully we can have other conversations to actually talk through them. Samasa?
Yeah, thank you to everyone for their contributions. I want to call what I'm about to say a comment, in as much as I want it to be something that everyone sits with, but you also can answer, but I really want people to sit with this. And what's gone through my mind during this conversation is, if the university is just another plantation in a slave society, what are the horizons of radical thought that are interested in its recuperation and reformation as opposed to its abolition? And what is abolition supposed to mean as it's being used here? So that's all I have.
Could you repeat the last thing you said one more time, just so I can think about it again? I did hear it. I just want you to repeat it.
Yeah. What are the horizons of radical thought that are interested in the recuperation and the reformation of the university as opposed to its abolition? And what do we want abolition to mean in these conversations?
That's a lot, because I think we're coming out of an era where the university was thought of as a possible refuge, not an actual, but a possible one. And the question is whether that's actually so, and if not, where. If one uses the language of the fugitive, to where. So yeah, I think that's a lot.
There are a number of moneyed interests, and also I think a dynamic under neoliberalism to destroy what is most vital about the university. But I still consider it a very exceptional and unique institution, as I was saying earlier, quite some time earlier. And therefore, I think any talk of the abolition of the university, it sounds to me, to my ears at least, suspiciously like one of the demands of the far right wing of American politics. It's exactly their desire. They would love people to pursue whatever it is that they're interested in intellectually, whatever scholarship they're doing, individually or outside the public eye, without the how could I put it, the imprimatur, if you could put it that way, that the university now as an institution, an inherited, precious institution, provides people. So it's difficult, within the university to continue to write things that are relevant, that are accessible to people, that are not merely, designed for professional advancement and so on. I mean, I publish both with commercial presses and with academic presses, and the paradox is that many of the academic presses are much more censorious and much more tied in to schools of thought that they don't want criticized or violated in some way, and therefore it becomes much more closed. And so there are these dynamics. The whole challenge posed recently by cancel culture, right, and virtue signaling and so on, as one of the dynamics within the organizing that could take place, that is trying to take place within the university. These are real problems that need to be thought through. So I would just say, and this is my last comment, I know that we're coming to the end of things. I thought Dylan was eloquent, and maybe those were the words we should have all ended on, but I'm saying that I just think that the university surely should be reformed, to take the first part of your comment/question, Samasa, but certainly not abolished. I think it's unthinkable, and it would be counter to all of our interests.
Everything we know is that this world can't go on. So there's part of the ruling class that wants to abolish knowing. So that's the meta question in a way. And it's sort of a tactical thing about, to what extent is the university a bulwark against the power of not knowing, and to what extent can it not fulfill that function? And not for me to say, I don't think. But
And I'll just honor the question Samasa asked by saying, yes, the university is a plantation, and with a plantation, you don't rehabilitate or reform it, you fucking burn it down and you try to build something new in its place.
Thank you. Thank you, Dylan. Shall we maybe try to wrap it up here, Julia?
Yeah, I think that's a place to end for today.
We do have a comment from Joshua Clover, a faculty at UC Davis. The Intercampus Faculty Cola Group, now continuing work under the name of the Intercampus Abolition Group, is beginning to plan fall actions towards police abolition in solidarity with the Cola movement and against its violent repression. We hope to pursue these plans alongside other groups and individuals. If you're interested in helping to organize and take part in direct abolitionist actions, please contact Joshua at janesugar@gmail.com. I'll drop that in the chat, preferably from a non-UC address. Thank you.
So thank you all. I think the bravery and commitment that you demonstrate is really, really inspiring to me, and I'm really grateful that you allowed us to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to FUC.
Thank you.
And also FUC.
Thank you to everyone who stuck with us for over 2 hours. That was incredible. We're really grateful. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you for all the panelists present and who had to leave early.
Okay. Bye-bye.
We'll see you all soon.